Thank you, Ashley. Good evening, everybody. Good to be with you again. I think the last time I did one of these with you all, it was pitch black outside, so it's nice to have some sunshine tonight. Well, it is where I am. Hope it is where you are. So without further ado, I'm Nathan Robinson, as some of you may remember, Regional Development Director for Capital Allowances here at CATAX. And I'm just going to run through a deck tonight to prompt some conversation and some questions, hopefully, around the subject of capital allowances. It's a bit of a refresher from the last one we did. Some of you may be pleased to know I've trimmed it down a little bit this time, just so we can allow more time for some Q&As at the end and some conversation. So as Ashley mentioned, if you have any pertinent questions, please raise your hand, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you, Ashley. You've already gone on. So what we'll cover is obviously how capital allowances work, a quick refresher for some of you who were on the last session, and obviously a helpful pointer for those of you that are joining for the first time. The qualifying criteria within capital allowances, I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about that. The important change that came into the landscape from HMRC, which has made capital allowances a hell of a lot more specialist than it used to be. And that legislation being the reason a number of claims are either restricted or completely evaporated, sadly, by the time we get to them. So I'll be covering those off. We'll also be looking at a couple of case studies to identify quick wins and summary closing questions. So nice, short, snappy session. We're nearly at the bank holiday, so I don't want to do death by PowerPoint tonight. So hopefully you'll enjoy it and find it insightful. Next slide, please, Ashley. So the what, the why, and the when around capital allowances, just a useful refresher for you. So what is it? It's a form of tax relief for commercial landlords who have purchased, who are purchasing, already own, or are building new commercial premises. In the pharmaceutical world, historically, medical centres and larger surgeries and pharmacies have proven very, very decent for capital allowances in terms of the level of plant and machinery within these buildings. So that's where the tax break is. It's the investment in embedded plant and machinery in these buildings. Biggest pushback we get is, my accountant surely is dealing with this, 95% of accountants don't cover embedded plant and machinery. They tend to focus on things that carry an individual invoice, things of loose trade items, as you might know it, furniture, IT equipment, that sort of stuff. The electricity, the water, the power, the security, the fire systems, much more embedded and often missed. So that's what we do. That's where the specialism is. Why does it exist? Well, the government, as you can understand, want to stimulate growth wherever possible. So if I'm investing in a building, buying a building, refurbishing a building, chances are I'm upping the capacity of the building. That means I'm going to earn more money, which means I'm going to pay more tax. That's the cold, hard truth of it. They know they're getting the ability to charge more tax by people investing. And like I said, pharmacies are particularly very, very good. Medical centres are very, very good because every room in the building tends to have qualifying plant. It's not like some of the properties we'll come on to in a minute where a lot of the building is not being fully utilised. Chances are most of these buildings are. So it's pretty much a win-win for all connected. When is a good time to look at this? Well, there are lots of different times, but typically in my experience, what I found is a vital time is when you're buying something. So if you've had an offer agreed on a building, an existing building, and you're buying it from somebody who was also running it as a pharmacy, or somebody who was also running it as a commercial entity, then it's crucial that you get timely, accurate advice, because as I'll come on to in a few slides, you'll see where the pitfalls are, where the trapdoors are, not being able to obtain any relief. However, there's also other events where capital allowances raise their head. If you're carrying out significant works to an existing building, that's capital expenditure. So that's perfectly acceptable to look at capital allowances at that point because you're investing again, and you're often ripping out existing plant and machinery that was there before. If you have a portfolio and you are reviewing that portfolio of pharmacies or properties, doesn't have to be pharmacies, can be any commercial property. But if you have a portfolio of buildings where you're considering transferring ownership or incorporating, again, a crucial time to just ask the question about what am I getting from these buildings in terms of capital allowances. Next slide, please, Ashley. So the sorts of things you find in a commercial building that qualify for capital allowances. Hopefully these icons will kind of give you a bit of a feel. We're talking about the stuff that wouldn't fall out of the building if you tipped it upside down and shook it. Ironically, these are things we use in our homes. You know, we wouldn't live in a house without heating. You wouldn't live in a house without lighting. But because they're residential, our homes are residential, they're not commercial, they don't qualify. So as soon as you walk into your medical centre or centres and you switch on a light, switch on your heating, suddenly these are the things that qualify, but are often missed. It says there are many, many more. The lists are significant, but essentially we're talking about the plant and machinery that's in the skin of the building that helps that building to operate. Next slide, please, Ashley. So eligible properties, obviously we're talking about pharmacies and medical centres today, so that's our main focus. You can see obviously GPs, dental practices there on the top row. And one thing I want to just focus on is areas where claims can often be restricted, because it's pertinent to do that. We know that many pharmacies are shop frontage, high street premises. So at the bottom there in the middle, you'll see retail units where the cursor is hovering nicely. Let's assume that half of that building is flats upstairs and it's a shop frontage on the bottom. That means half of that building is resi, half of that building is commercial, and it'd only be the bottom half where the commercial activity is that we could consider. So it's just worth noting, because if you've paid 3 million for a building and you think, oh, I can get capital allowances on 3 million, it'll actually be on about 1.5 because half of the building is commercial, half is residential. So I just wanted to clarify that for some of our listeners. Next slide, please. So I've danced around it a couple of times so far this evening. Two's a good one. Two's actually quite good for me. HMRC, how it changed the landscape. So in 2014, I say prior to 2014, you buy a commercial property from somebody and the contracts don't talk about capital allowances at all, which they often don't. Someone could make a claim on their building without too much pushback from HMRC. 2014 changed that, and it now says that in the CPSE documents of the purchase contract, both buyer and seller have to agree on what has been done around capital allowances, a pooling requirement as it's known, mandatory. So it must accurately record an amount of money that is agreed by buyer and seller that is available to pass across to the buyer to make a claim. However, this change came in, we still find contracts are blank. So if there is a property that's purchased post 14, which they all will now, post 14, someone buys a property, the contracts are silent. There is a 2-year window, as it says on the 4th bullet point, a 2-year window for the buyer to go back to the vendor and ask for the allowances to be passed across if they've not claimed. So this is where we at Catax earn our keep, because this is where the specialism is. We are able to advise clients on what the contracts need to say. We can report back where we think the contracts are invalid or wrong and need to be changed, because what we're actually doing is we are processing a claim in the seller's name and passing it across to the buyer because it's what the buyer is entitled to if the seller has done nothing. So this is the area that's made it very complex. A lot of people have run for the hills that used to do capital allowances. This is where the specialism is. So as you can probably imagine, for an accountant, bless them, an everyday accountant, and indeed a solicitor, they tend to say to the client, the other person is the person to speak to. Solicitor says speak to your accountant. Accountant says speak to your lawyer. Client's left not getting timely advice. So won't be a surprise to you on this slide to hear that our number one clients are accountants, because they recognize the specialism here and they want to give their client the right advice. So it's a subtle change, and it also alludes to internal transfers of property, which is why I mentioned on the other slide about a good time to look at it. Anything done post 14 where a property is changing hands, 2014 rules apply, be that internally or be that externally. Next slide, please, Ashley. So I've rattled on for a little while there. I talked about the idiosyncrasies and the nuts and the bolts of the legislation and the changes. But what does it all mean in terms of numbers? So I just wanted to put in front of you a case study from a recent client we helped. And the reason why I've put this one and chosen this one is because this property was actually purchased in post 14, but it wasn't shackled by any of the 2014 legislation. And that was because it was purchased from a pension. Pensions can't qualify, charities can't qualify, local authorities, including councils, can't qualify. So any properties that are purchased from any of these entities, we don't need to worry about that slide I've just gone through. They are relatively clean claims, and the client can enjoy the current purchase price, not what the seller paid for it previously. Well, as you can see, the numbers look pretty good, don't they? 1.95 mil purchase price, and the capital allowance is identified at 357k, resulting in a tax benefit of 67k. And as we've captured it nice and early, as it says there, we will capture it inside 2 years of it being purchased. 100% relief could be enjoyed using annual investment allowance. So it's quite a powerful, it's quite a significant amount of money. Who doesn't need 67 grand back in their bank nowadays with everything that's gone on? But obviously it's one of thousands of reviews that we do. We cover pretty much any purchase of a commercial building from 500k upwards, any refurbishments of 200k upwards, including new builds. So as you can imagine, we see all sorts, but I thought that was quite a powerful, not just because of the numbers, but because of the fact it was from a pension. So if anybody out there knows that any of their properties were purchased from pensions, as long as they're not your pensions, then please do reach out. Next slide, please, Ashley. So that's it. I said it'd be painless, didn't I? That's quarter of an hour, nice and short and snappy. So capital allowances can be a significant win. HMRC recognise capital allowances as a legitimate form of claiming. They actually recognise this now as the preferred method of capitalising. And it's because it's fair. Why take a long time to write down relief for something that you can claim now? So it's much cleaner than your normal depreciation. There is a set criteria for capital allowances, as we've covered. In the pharmaceutical healthcare industry, as long as the buildings are being used for a commercial entity, they're not vacant. There could be a tenant in there, or you can be operating from there, doesn't matter. As long as the building is largely used as a commercial entity, as opposed to having 3 flats above it with a shop underneath, as I've covered, they tend to yield less of a result. And it's a use it or lose it for good. That 2-year window, the property's purchased 2014 and later, if the contracts are blank and you don't receive timely advice about what is eligible to you and available to you, then they will evaporate forever. and the only time someone would be able to do a claim on that building in future is if they refurbed it, ripped it out, started again. So that's it, Ashley. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Nathan. I did get a few questions, but they were more based around me asking people to mute themselves. So if anyone has any questions, if you'd either like to use the raise the hand, or you can put them into the Q&A chat button. I know, Nathan, are you happy for me to share these slides to the attendees? Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay, so just to say, yes, I will be sharing the slide deck with everyone who's attended this evening. No, it's all very quiet out there, which I'm quite surprised about, because usually we have quite a few questions on this one. Okay, oh, got someone here. All right, Faloa, sorry for the name, I probably said that wrong, but do you have a question?
My question is, if I have a residential on top of the pharmacy, that cannot qualify for capital allowance.
The residential element, yes, you're correct. The residential element won't be, but the commercial premises underneath could. But obviously, as you can see, the building is then restricted in terms of 50% qualifying, 50% not. Doesn't mean you can't claim capital allowances. It just means, will it be worth your time financially? Because other things come into play at that point. It's how long has the property been held for? Going back, what was the purchase price? Has any work been done to it? Who's responsible to the work in the commercial area? Is it the tenant or the landlord? So it's just a footnote for you to be aware of, because we do get a lot of inquiries where my building was purchased for 3 million, like I mentioned, but it's 2 floors of resi and 1 floor of commercial. That's the restriction. So it can sometimes mean that clients don't get the outcome they expected. Whereas if you compare that to a new build medical center where all of the property is being used for commercial use, then typically these will range a lot higher in terms of the outcomes for clients. So we'll always look at every scenario, every query that a client brings us, but it's just to manage expectations really for them.
Right. My next question is, hello?
Yeah.
My next question is, do you deal with VAT on building on top of your pharmacy?
No, however, I wasn't expecting this question, but yeah, however, no, not Catax. It's not an area Catax covers. However, we have just been acquired, as you can see on the slides, by a company called Ryan. So we're now part of the Ryan Group. Ryan are a massive tax concern in the States, small offices in England. So that acquisition happened earlier this year, and they do. So it's an area very, very prevalent in the Ryan stable. So as things move forward with the acquisition, I'm sure that'll be an area that we will be offering advice to clients on.
It's okay, but it's not something you offer at the moment.
Depends on if there's a portfolio of properties where VAT is a concern, then there may be moves that I can make with Ryan. But at the moment, I haven't been introduced to anybody. I haven't had any training. So if it's something you wanted me to look at, I could try and find someone at Ryan who could speak to you.
All right, that would be smashing. All right, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. And we also have a question from, is it Banji?
Yeah, Banji is my name. Thank you very much for the presentation. I have 3 questions. Yeah, the first one, you mentioned if the building is the top is residential and the down is commercial. Like our property, although the top is for residential use, but it's different. I mean, it's owned by a different landlord. The pharmacy is separately owned by us, but the top is owned by a different landlord. It's not although it's in the same building, there are 6, like we have a dental surgery beside us, another flat on top of the dental surgery owned by a different landlord as well. So there are 4 different landlords in the same building. So do we still qualify?
Yes, yes. I mean, it's all your element is all commercial, right? So
Yeah.
what you're responsible for and what you hold long lease or freehold on is a commercial entity. So yeah, there is potentially, depending on what's gone before you. I mean, in terms of how long you've owned it for, what you purchased it for, who owned it prior to you, did you buy it post 14? All of these things we'd consider before sort of going ahead with an exercise for you, because we want it to be a good use of your time. So yeah, but in that scenario, yeah, you're responsible for just the commercial element.
Okay, thank you for that. So my second question is that I think you just mentioned it now. Is about whether it's because when we purchased the property was just less than a year ago. It was a long lease, about 900 years lease. And so so my question is, does it matter whether the purchase is via long lease or whether it is via freehold?
No, I mean, it really depends on a couple of things. So if you are subject to a lease premium, so if you've paid a lease premium for the building, then you may be able to look at what's in the entire building that might be eligible for capital allowances. If you haven't paid a lease premium and you're essentially a tenant of the building, then you can't make a claim because it's the landlord's right to claim, unless you are a tenant who has ripped it out and started again, because that is your capital expenditure, not the landlord's. So we do see that quite a lot. You know, tenants are going into some significant buildings, paying a significant amount of money nowadays and ripping it out and starting again. So that for them is all about their refurb, but the claim is built upon their refurb costs, not what they purchased the lease for or what the building's worth. It's what the work has cost. So it can often be, speaking from the other side of the fence here, it can often be an area that we find claims don't go anywhere, where you've got a landlord saying, I own a building, it's got commercial space downstairs, can I claim? On paper, yes, you can. We go in, we have a look, and actually all of the plant and machinery that is in the commercial area downstairs has actually been put there by a tenant themselves because they've done a big refurb. And that's where the claim falls down, because it's about capital expenditure that's been borne by the tenant, not the landlord.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. And the final one, sorry for taking a lot of your time. The final one is that, does it really work? Because the example you gave during your presentation was worth of, close to £2 million. Our own property is a small property, less than £500,000. Is it still worth the time and the energy for the capital tax?
Yeah, we say £500,000 because you've got to consider a number of different factors. 2014 is a big one. So if you've got somebody now buying a property for 500,000 and we're in post 14, and the previous owner of that building could have claimed as well, because they are either using it as a pharmacy or they were taking rent from tenants on a commercial basis, not residential, then we have to consider what they could have claimed, which needs to be passed across to our client. But obviously what they purchased it for would be less than what our client is purchasing it for. So we have to allow for what 2014 says, because it's very, very clever in the way it says buyer and seller must agree, but what the seller could have claimed would be based upon what they paid for it, and then the seller takes what is left off of what they've paid for it. So it can be, you know, if someone's owned a building for 30 years and is selling it now in post 14 world and could have claimed capital allowances but purchased it for 100k, our client is now buying it for 500. It may not be worth it when you take into consideration that the allowances have to be taxable at corp tax at 19%. So the actual tax relief to the client at the end of this, you know, can sometimes look not worth it. But we get there for the clients. We'd much rather have clients having the right advice, timely advice, because 2014 has tripped loads of people up. We'd rather give you that advice before entering into any sort of instruction for you, because that we can do ahead of terms being agreed. It's probably just worth mentioning, actually, Catax does work on a contingency basis, so we don't charge fees until we can evidence that the claim is A, possible, and B, financially viable to all parties.
Okay, then, and if we want to take it forward, how do we get in touch with you?
Ashley, is there going to be like an email with my details coming out?
Yes, there will be. So tomorrow morning you will receive an email with a copy of this presentation, as well as Nathan's details on there, so you will be able to reach out directly to him.
Thank you so much for the very useful answers. Thank you.
That's okay, Raji. There's no such thing as a silly question with capital allowances. The legislation is very detailed. So yes, by all means, get in touch.
We've got a few on the Q&A as well. The first one is from Matthew. It says, I have owned the property since 1997. Are there any avenues for claiming allowances?
Hi, Matthew. So if you've owned it for since 97, then I'd be keen to sort of know, you haven't got to tell me on here, but the purchase price may be relatively lower than what the building is worth now. If that's the case, then there may be allowances there, but again, depending on the type of property, has it got resi above it, it may not be financially viable to look at for you. If you've carried out any work at that building since and added to it, like I said, via refurbs or fit outs, then, and that's more recent, then that could make it a worthwhile exercise for you. So it's very much holding that 500k figure in your head, using that as your yardstick, or the 200k refurb figure as well, because that's where we find claims become viable for people to look at.
Okay, so we've got two more questions, and then we might wrap it up unless anyone's got anything urgent. Max has asked, if a tenant has refurbished premises and then some years later they purchase the property, can they claim CA?
Oh, great question. Yes, they can. Had one of those recently, actually, not on a pharmacy, but on an office building. So yes, if they're during their time as a tenant, they refurbed, then obviously that has to be taken off of consideration in terms of what they're eligible for upon becoming a landlord. So, but in short, yes, because what you'll find is, again, depending on the type of property, the costs may be low enough to mean that there's still some other bits and pieces in there that they didn't touch when they did the refurb. So sanitary, heating, water, air conditioning, some types of flooring, fire doors. They may not have touched those. It may be more of a cosmetic refurb. So we'd look at both avenues. What did they do as a tenant, and what are they entitled to in terms of inheriting the building? Hello, Ashley, you're on mute.
Sorry. I was going to say, we've got Amber, who is waiting to ask a question as well.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Amber, yeah.
Hi, I own a pharmacy, part residential above, and I own the commercial unit next door. I'm currently going through a CPO, compulsory purchase order, where the developers want to move me into their retail unit after demolishing me and then relocate me in there. In terms of my ownership, I've owned the building for approximately 17 odd years, which I've not had any capital allowance, but I've done comprehensive refurbishment work during the years, especially the last 5 years. Previous, I haven't claimed any capex, but moving forward, is this something that you guys could help me in terms of a shell outfit that they're going to give me to relocate possibly into?
Yeah, so in that sense, you're buying, are you buying it, or are you going to be a tenant?
Well, this is it. This is where we're currently under negotiations at the moment. So it's all up in the air. So ideally, I want to be, effectively a long leaseholder.
Mhm.
But as you could probably imagine, in the CPO world, they only offer me a 25-year lease. So whereas I'm a freeholder at the moment, so this is a bit of a, turning point that I'm hopefully going to, if possible, strike and deal with a long peppercorn lease.
Okay.
So
So in that scenario, then it would be about what you're going to spend. So it's a shell, and it's from a developer. Interestingly, I didn't mention in my slides what I normally do. Developers can't claim allowances either. They tend to, 9 times out of 10, they tend to hold it as stock, not a fixed asset. So any property that's been amongst the guys that are listening in today that have come from a developer, new builds, perfect for capital allowances 9 times out of 10. But to go back to your question, Amber, then yes, it'll be about what you do in that building to bring it up to speed, up to what you need it to do to run your business. That's your investment, and that's what the capital allowances exercise will be done on, because the developer has just based on like a cat A fit out. They just got it to a shell, so it needs to be filled with plant and machinery. So that's where your expenditure comes in.
right. So on that point, would I be eligible for? I can understand the fit out costs. Is that something I can put in my negotiations now, or should I wait?
No, because it's retrospective, but it'll be a case of once you've done the work,
Right.
in conjunction with when your year end is, you'll reach the end of your tax period where you saw the investment, and that's the point where you can do the exercise. Your accountant can say, right, okay, well, first year of trading says there's a corp tax position of X, but we've had this investment over here, which which we're going to treat as a capital allowance. So that's where the tax mitigation happens. So capital allowances is not like any other, in the sense that it's not a tax credit. It's not like R&D. It's good old mitigation of tax. So there needs to be obviously a capital allowance eligible property or activity, and then there needs to be the profitability there to offset the tax. So for you, it'll be once the work's been done, once you're in, showing the profit for that tax period, that's when it comes off your corp tax bill.
Right.
There's nothing that needs to go into the terms, because it's your expenditure. It's got nothing to do with acquisition. It's just your expenditure.
Even though they might be responsible for paying for it.
If they're responsible for paying for it, then yes, there can be a number of different ways that landlords can approach this. Some landlords want to give like a rent-free period that's not really a rent-free period. If that's the case, then yes, the contracts need to stipulate what is happening, because obviously we need the door to be left ajar for you. If they're saying, look, we're going to pay half and you'll pay the rest, then there needs to be in the contracts to stipulate that you're going to be able to benefit from those allowances. Yes, that is a valid question. It's one that we see a lot.
Sure. Brilliant. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Amber, pleasure.
Cheers.
We've got Flo again. I've asked him to unmute. Maybe he's brought something up there.
Yes, I'm back again. With the reference to the last gentleman, and you said that for him to claim capital allowance, there must be a profit. If there's no profit in that year, can he be allowed to carry over the capital allowance tax claim in the following year? Or
yes. Yeah, there is no. If it's capital expenditure, i.e. refurbishment or buying from a developer or buying from someone that can't claim allowances, there is no time limit. The 2-year window is really about where you've got to challenge contracts where both parties could have claimed. So with refurbs, it's really good because it's capital expenditure. So it's not linked to any acquisition. So if a client can't use it because of lack of profitability, but they are profitable the next year, then absolutely they can use it. One thing we tend to find a lot with this issue is the annual investment allowance angle. So the annual investment allowance will allow a client to obtain 100% relief that they are entitled to in one go if they're profitable in 2 tax periods since they made the investment. So if someone does a 250k refurb and then COVID hits and they're not profitable again for another four years because they're carrying forward losses, the capital allowances will still be there. They just won't be able to enjoy it at 100%. Their accountant will need to write it down every year at set levels until the relief is gone. So again, it could be the lack of AIA, the lack of annual investment allowance in a claim can mean it's not worth it for clients. Hence, the gentleman who purchased in 97, he's not going to get annual investment allowance because it was more than 2 years ago. But if there's been any work carried out a short while ago, it may bump the claim up. So annual investment allowance in 2014 are two key reasons why timely, accurate advice matter.
All right, thank you.
Pleasure.
Great, thanks, Nathan. I don't see any other questions coming in. I'll kind of give it a short countdown. But like I did say, obviously we will share the presentation tomorrow and your details as well. So if anyone has any other questions, they can get hold of you. Is that correct? Great. Yep, no other questions. So yes, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Appreciate that it is a Tuesday before the bank holiday. So hopefully you'll have lots of time to think about this over the weekend and get hold of Nathan. Nathan, thanks again for joining.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Have a good evening.
Good night.
Bye.